Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What we heard from the Chancellor was a budget that reeks of desperation and deceit, from a government that knows it's lost the trust of the British people. A bottom-of-the-barrel budget, nothing to make families truly better off after the catastrophic fall in living standards we've seen under the Conservatives, and no plan for long-term economic growth, no real extra support for the NHS and our public services, and no end in sight to the years of unfair tax hikes. Just a last-ditch attempt from the Conservative Party to cling on to power. But now, Madam Deputy Speaker, people have had enough of this government's empty promises. What they want is a general election to get this out-of-touch government out of Downing Street. They are sick and tired of a government that promised in last year's budget to grow the economy, only to plunge it into recession. With a government that promised to bring down NHS waiting lists, only to let them continue up and up, and that promised to cut tax, but instead has hit families with years of unfair stealth tax rises. Never before have I seen a government deliver weaker public services, higher taxes and zero growth all at the same time, and all in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Madam Deputy Speaker, I fear that by designing his economic policy to give a short-term sugar rush to Conservative backbenchers, the Chancellor is condemning millions of families to high mortgage rates for much, much longer. And you don't need to take my word for it. Look at the OBR. The OBR forecasts mortgage rates staying at 4% or more for the next 5 years at least. This is a disaster for homeowners across the United Kingdom. And let's look at taxes. The Chancellor seems desperate to convince people he's letting them keep more of their own money, but he's fooling no one. Everyone can see his supposed tax cut for what it really is, a badly executed conjuring trick. Giving with one hand, but taking away twice as much with the other. Since last April, a typical household has already paid another £1,500 extra because of the Chancellor's stealth tax on income tax thresholds. That's money they're simply not going to get back. But even after today's announcement, that same family will pay an additional £366 in tax next year because the Chancellor has frozen their tax-free allowance. And on top of that, they've got soaring mortgage payments, food prices and energy bills all to worry about. This tax cut has already been wiped out by the time the ink dried on the Chancellor's speech. But people were also looking for investment in our public services, especially our NHS. Across our country, I see more and more frustration that nothing seems to work anymore under this government. People can't get a hospital appointment in time, they can't get to see their GP in time, and they can't get an ambulance on time. Like in Hampshire, where the local NHS is so stretched, there's a proposal to close the A&E at the Royal Hampshire County Hospital. In Manchester, where Stepping Hill Hospital has had an entire outpatient ward closed for months because it's unsafe for patients and staff. Or in South London, where St Helier Hospital has been left to crumble with no sign of the investment promised by this government. A&E and maternity services are at risk of closure. Not for a second. When the Chancellor makes cruel cuts to vital services, it doesn't just affect numbers on a spreadsheet, it affects people's lives. He either doesn't get that, or he just doesn't care. I give way.
I'm hearing what the Representative was saying about investment, but he was actually part of a coalition from 2010 to 2015, which savagely cut services in the North East, including local government expenditure and health expenditure and others, which is now having to be picked up because the austerity has continued. Does he take any responsibility for his role in where we're at with some of these crumbling infrastructure?
But I say to the Honourable Gentleman quite gently, if he looks at the spending plans that were proposed by the Labour Party going to the 2010 election, they were actually worse than what actually happened. And moreover, we fought the Conservatives in the government to maintain spending on education, which we did, and then they cut it after 2015. Madam Deputy Speaker, if we look now at the economy, perhaps the most out-of-touch claim by the Chancellor is that the economy is turning a corner. The only corner the economy is turning under this government is from stagnation to recession. They left our economy smaller than it was in 2022 when the Prime Minister took office. The best growth rate they've achieved in the last 3 quarters of 2023 is 0%. GDP per capita, people's share in our country's wealth, has been falling for nearly 2 years in a row. That's the longest stretch on record, and it's left the average household £1,500 poorer. And there's worse to come, Madam Deputy Speaker. Nearly 5 million mortgage holders will soon see their repayments skyrocket by an average of £240 a month due to the high interest rates. This is the government's real track record, a recession made in Downing Street with no hint of a chance to turn things around. The Chancellor could have stood up today and given people a fair deal. He could have cancelled the unfair tax hike he's planned for April and raised the tax-free personal allowance. He could have properly funded the NHS to bring down waiting lists and let more people return to work, helping to grow our economy. He could have championed unpaid carers and raised the carers allowance. He could have supported people with the cost of living by reversing his tax cuts for the big banks to help those struggling with their mortgage payments. And he could have presented a serious plan for economic growth by launching an industrial strategy, reforming business rates and standing up for our small businesses. Instead, he went for one last roll of the dice in a desperate attempt to cling on to power. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think people have already made up their minds. So the government must do the right thing, call a general election right now before they do even more damage to our wonderful country.